fame and fortune.
The early 1980s is a confusing time to look back on if you're trying to trace the arc of the classic canon. It's positively anarchic compared to the regimented corporate sounds that dominated the start of the next decade, and while 1970 was the twilight of the gods, long developing trends were just coming to fruition to replace those gods. In the early 1980s, it seemed that the dinosaur rock band model had been fatally wounded by not just the lacerating attack on its credibility that punk rock was. Be warned, there were damned fewer dinosaurs ahead in the 80s, but the three major trends that replaced it, hip-hop, dance pop and heavy metal, were for whatever reason either in their infancy or struggling for their commercial identity. In 1980, the charts seemed to be up for grabs as everything from synth pop to rockabilly jostled to be the next big thing. If the 1980s were anything, they were the decade of the solo superstar, as the rapidly expanding entertainment media, spearheaded by the twin juggernauts of MTV and touring, now organised with military efficiency where the artists were commoditised as the product and the audience as consumers, offered them a level of saturation and projection hitherto unimaginable and inverting the paradigm that classic rock acts relied on, the mystery and myth method. The 80s saw a proliferation of media-savvy superstars who used the new battery of technology, promotional stratagem, curated personality and tours that divided the world into territories like so many mob bosses did in their cities. In what was to become the basis for a model that still endures today, we saw the rise of the pop megastar Phil Collins, Prince, Bruce Springsteen, George Michael, Billy Joel, Tina Turner, Whitney Houston, Bryan Adams and even David Bowie dominated top 40 radio. Their new videos were increasingly complex, high budget and keenly awaited. We had primetime television interrupted here in Australia once for the premiere of a Michael Jackson video. Apropos of Jackson, he was a dominant, emblematic figure for that decade, an artist who used every variation of artifice to lead the public on a dizzy goose chase where he honed his art to eventually a perfect sheen in the studio, whose music videos are still benchmarks for the art and whose sale figures for 1982's Thriller will never be matched. Yet he seems in a lot of ways a distant figure, ubiquitous behind but not integral to the panorama of the decade. But there was one figure who culturally, musically and politically embodied music in the decade and was, more than anyone, the primary driver, for better or worse, behind the changes that swept the industry. And her name was Madonna. The 1980s, as we understand them then, officially began on January the 9th, 1983, when the 24-year-old Madonna made her first appearance on television. It wasn't a triumphant debut, the show dancing on air only screened in 7 US East state markets. She performed her debut single, Everybody, which had been a solid club hit, selling over 150,000 singles, but she remained rooted in New York. Her initial deal with Sire was for 3 12-inch singles for $15,000 each, but she had to pay the costs for recording them. For her second, Burning Up, she and her collaborator Stephen Bray rolled the dice on a higher production video and Warner Brothers staff producers, in this case ex-Miles Davis man Reggie Lucas. Released 5 months later in March 1983, Burning Up went as high as number 3 on the US dance charts and saw her doing extensive promotion, outside even the USA, making her first appearances in England and on Australian television. Based on these sales, Madonna's contract was upgraded to make an album. The 2 singles were earmarked to appear on the debut album, which was recorded at Sigma Sound in New York in May 1983. Produced at first by Lucas before he handed over to Jellybean Benitez, Madonna's then boyfriend, after disagreements with Madonna, the self-titled album, the title was originally going to be Lucky Star, but Madonna insisted be changed. It was the first of 4 albums she was to release in the decade which, while not creating dance pop as a genre, became its gold standard and laid out the rules for the genre, which still holds strong today. The album, Madonna, is from its trilling opening glissando to the finishing ecstasies of Everybody, a sleek, tricked-out extension of Chic's propulsive dance music. It's not as bass-heavy as disco was, nor is it as intricately arranged. In fact, in isolation, almost everything played here is fairly simple. It appears that the bass lines have had a little extra attention, but they're primarily melodic lines. The rhythmic drive comes from the dry, rigid drum sounds, the insistent synth bass ostinatos, and the jagged, chattery synths which stretch out to dance floor lengths with Madonna's eager, unsophisticated vocals acting as a cheerleader. The groove is relentless. It's a whole greater than the sum of its parts. Students of poesy and prosody need, however, to look elsewhere. The lyrics are purely functional and lack even the charm of, say, James Brown's improvised psychobabble. Like a lot of contemporary female pop singers, the easiest point of attack on Madonna seems to be her voice. But on the debut, while she doesn't have the confidence she'd have found in Fool by her third, True Blue, and here she is relying very much on personality to project the songs, she does indeed have an awful lot of personality. Her range here hasn't developed to the 3-octave plus she eventually possessed, but she knows how to use the contrast between her lower chest voice and her squeaky little girl head voice to great effect. The songs, being fundamentally dance workouts, do go on perhaps a little longer than they might. Physical attraction is a particular offender, but with a snip here and there, they were perfect radio fodder. One remarkable thing about the album is that despite its bright and ecstatic feeling, all of the songs are composed in minor keys, with the exception of Borderline, which is in a breezy C major. The songs concern themselves peripherally with themes of dancing, self-expression and togetherness. It's a little like a cute, slightly bratty, slightly hyperactive little sister to Prince's 1999 album the year before, but it's more economical and defined and memorable by its hit singles. As a standalone, this is a wonderfully fun album. Madonna is incredibly present in the record, unlike some of her pretenders who followed her, Britney Spears, Rihanna, etc., who are simply blank canvases for their producers. The sheer force of her personality and her chutzpah dominate the songs. As part of the set of 4 records she made in the 80s, it can get dwarfed a little by the fuller arrangements and sharper pop focus of Like a Virgin and True Blue, which each benefit from her growing vocal confidence, or can seem a little naive next to the sophistication and ambition of Like a Prayer. But musically, it is, if not the cornerstone of a genre that came to rival and eventually surpass hip-hop as the most listened to music form in the world, dance pop. What it did musically in some ways pales to what it achieved culturally, because it is one of the few debut albums that bore a transformative impact on aspects of culture beyond how it rewrote the pop scenes. Many albums changed music. Madonna's debut was one of the few albums that changed the world. That almost 25-year-old with the remarkable eyes we see staring back at us from that album cover was the catalyst for 2 profound changes which are still being felt today. One immediate and visible, and one existential change which took time to come to fruit. The immediate revolution Madonna swept in was in the visual aesthetic of the era, her layered do-it-yourself emphasis of style over fashion, as in style representing the individual beating back the 70s ethos of fashion representing the corpus, that clash of lingerie as outerwear and the chunky heavy accessories, bustier and metallic boy toy belt on the cover of Like a Virgin against the boho chic in her skimpies on the inner cover, the 50s throwback including the iconic cover portrait and gym-buffed body of True Blue, and the seeming rejection of all of that in the dark-haired, bare midriff hippie waif of Like a Prayer. So influential was she that she became the first singer to appear on the covers of US, UK, French and Italian Vogue magazines. Vogue? That sounds like a good idea for a song. Her influence persisted so long and so pervasively that a whole new generation of Madonna wannabes, Pink, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Katy Perry, Rihanna and most egregiously Lady Gaga, sprung up in the new century. I'd even go so far as to say most of the look of the mid-80s to early 90s hair metal bands was in some way a derivation of her layered, dirtbag chic style. But where Madonna had her greatest and most lasting impact, beyond her music career, was her acting as a catalyst for the complete revision of feminist theory that led to the fall of what was known as second-wave feminism and the incorporation of the reaction by women to her emergence into some of the central tenets of third-wave feminism that developed in the early 1990s, and her creating an example of what Camille Paglia was a brilliant woman who was mentored in her language studies by Harold Bloom, the patron saint of the righteous Bojambo. I personally disagree with almost everything Paglia says, but I love the way she says it anyway. What Paglia called post-feminism, the state where women turn away from the Marxian collectivist feminist doctrine and pursue avenues of individual empowerment. An example might be how the generation of the 1920s took the advances won for them by the suffragettes along with the opportunities illustrated by an expanding media and turned to individualism and hedonism, becoming what we might call the flappers, which caused great conflict with the former generation of thinkers and the eventual redundancy of their model of activist feminism. In the 1960s, a cadre of writers such as Gloria Steinem, Germaine Greer, Kate Millett et al. Developed ideas first posited in Simone de Beauvoir's seminal, no pun intended, 1946 work The Second Sex. SDB was the lover of TRB 102's hero Jean-Paul Sartre. and developed what became known as second-wave feminism. While it resulted in some tremendous conversations about women and their rights and role in society, its killing floor was essentially the same as the first-wave feminisms and the flappers. It came primarily from a white, middle-class female perspective and was unconcerned with the specific issues of women in minorities or indeed outside capitalist cultures. Melbourne girl Germaine Greer wrote a very controversial 1970 novel, The Female Eunuch, which pointed out that Western familial systems were the fundamental oppressor and devitalizer of women, rendering them what she termed eunuchs. Second-wave feminism was soundly anchored to collectivist grassroots activism, which emphasized cultural rather than systemic change. And this was the prevailing philosophy both academically and practically through the 1970s. In 1983, when Madonna emerged, she suddenly, through her saturation in the media and her radically different approach to engaging both with that media and the industry with which she could leverage her media influence within, started posing uncomfortable questions to the establishment. Madonna was all about the individual above the collective. The dance floor, for example, to her was a collection of individuals expressing themselves, not a mass attempting to validate a movement, and her audience was much the same thing. She was just a thread in the common cloth of what women then saw as liberation. Madonna openly acknowledged and embraced what became known in the 1990s as intersectionality. Black, white, straight, gay, whatever. She invited everybody to sing, dance, and express themselves. Her world was a lot more reflective of the world of her female fans than the hidebound, suburban academic world that the current tottering feminist structure imagined. Madonna encouraged the expression of sexuality, whatever that was, even to the point of commercializing her own sexuality and acknowledging that sexuality was an empowering tool, which blew the notion of the female eunuch out of the water instantly. Empowering to what? Empowering to at least an economic equality and parity in terms of personal control and authorship. This was a serious affront to the prevailing cultural and intellectual corpus of feminism, which was, again, fundamentally collectivist, anti-commercial, and anti-popular culture. She paid no attention to ideas of patriarchy. She was, in her own way, an exemplar actor in a free marketplace, with her entrepreneurial sexuality and emphasis. Madonna's world was, in a manner of speaking, an ultimate product of Reaganomics. An idea, a product, a marketplace. She just added the energy to bring them all together. Finding their audience suddenly distracted from feminism as a collective activist concept, seeing it turned into an individual pursuit, led to a massive backlash against Madonna from feminist groups. So much so that defenders like Camille Paglia were very thin on the ground, only to emerge many years later as feminist writers looked at her impact from a distance and distilled and progressively retconned the lessons of it into the third wave doctrine that they were developing. Madonna, or the post-feminist phenomenon, was a symptom of a rise of a rejection of structural feminism amongst women for a concept of more personal empowerment, from the communal to the individual, rejecting the notion that pro-woman is anti-man and embracing and integrating the place of feminism in popular culture and consumerism as opposed to the second wave's intellectual dismissal of it. Madonna went on to dominate the decade on both the charts and in the cultural consciousness. Her follow-up album, Like a Virgin, made her a superstar, and for me it's still the most enjoyable album from the 1980s I have in my collection. The production is fuller, it's more pop-focused but still relentless in its grooves, and Madonna herself is much more confident and relatable. 1986 True Blue, which opened with the spectacular Papa Don't Preach and Open Your Heart, is a party album with few peers, even if it does just slack a little at the end. And 1989's stunning Like a Prayer, often considered her magnum opus, veers from club slammers like Express Yourself to deeper ruminations such as Oh Father, which, in only making number 20 on the US charts, broke her then record streak of 16 straight top 5 singles, winning her critical plaudits from the so-called serious rock press. Even Prince came to pay homage to her on Like a Prayer. The 90s were a difficult time for her. She still sold shedloads of albums, but there were a succession of confused movie soundtracks, albums overstuffed with filler like erotica, or somnambulant Marvin Gaye-isms like bedtime stories, before she came roaring back with 1998's brilliant Ray of Light. The new century went on, and so did Madonna. Everything she did, musically or personally, still commanded the immediate attention of both the traditional and social media. She's 66 now. It's difficult for me to think of Madonna as a senior citizen. Curiously, she isn't a grandmother yet. She's still working on new music, or her last album, 2019's Madam X, barely sold 500,000 copies, and seemingly trying to create some kind of legacy or insert herself into a legacy of social activism. So becomes a legend, I guess. We are living in a material world, and she is a material girl, and her material accomplishments are phenomenal. Here in Australia, she placed 60 out of 61 consecutive releases in the top 40, 11 number ones, 14 top 5s, and 14 other top 10s. Her 201 million physical sales make her, behind the Beatles, Michael Jackson, and Elvis Presley, the fourth biggest album seller of all times. In terms of album equivalents, she's fifth. Queen slip in ahead of her on streams. She's also the fifth biggest selling physical singles artist of all time. There is a very select group of once-in-a-lifetime artists who, beyond being good and successful at what they do, actually cause change in the culture around them. Madonna opened the doors for a generation, inspired its identity, and was ultimately consumed and enshrined by it the same way that Elvis Presley or the Beatles were. Perhaps like no other artist ever, she's had to bear the slings and arrows both of critics and of outrageous fortune, but she is who she is. And if you ask her who that is, well, she's already written the reply. Bitch, I'm Madonna.